His champagne froze halfway to his lips because he hadn't expected the pass to RSV. Lights strung along the rooftop threw a warm glow over polished faces and designer jackets. The city unfolded behind them like a spreadsheet of ambitions-lit towers, glass facades, a skyline that had learned to measure itself in rounds and valuations. Sebastian Cole stood near the terrace rail with a drink he barely tasted, feeling the room bend toward him. Tonight was his birthday, and the speech he'd practiced earlier hung ready behind his teeth, charming, confident, celebratory. Lydia by his side laughed at something a board member said, her hand resting where it showed subtle, irreversible. He saw her then, not a flame of memory, but a silhouette against the far balcony, smaller, precise, a figure who seemed to belong to a different light, someone who had smelled of coffee and solder and whiteboard dust. For a second the party condensed, the string lights dimmed in his vision, and everything else went muffled, like a microphone cutting out. Kesha Morgan had come to his party. Sebastian's laugh dried into a held breath. He had spent years controlling narratives. The founder who'd turned a garage idea into a unicorn, the charismatic face of innovation. He'd curated this, image interviews, keynote photos, press releases. The truth of how their company had actually been built had been inconvenient. It didn't fit the arc investors liked. He had edited it away. He had, in many small legal and managerial ways, ensured that the story read his way. She looked at him once, a brief, clinical scan, and then turned her attention elsewhere. Kesha's expression was unreadable in that light, no hatred, no pleading, only a careful appraisal, as if she were measuring the distance between now and every late night they'd shared. Before Sebastian could pull himself together, a man approached from the step stall, composed, moving like someone who had learned to make entrances look like decisions. Benjamin Crow moved through the crowd with the certainty of capital. He had the kind of easy control that came from deciding what mattered with a checkbook and a handshake. Sebastian had met him at dinners where the word scale acted as a benediction. He knew Benjamin's name had the power to tilt markets and hush dissent. Benjamin stopped 3 feet from Kesha. Their greeting was not intimate but immediate. A measured nod, an exchange of information through eyes. For Sebastian, it felt like a cold door clicking closed. The mood at the edge of the terrace shifted. Conversation stuttered. Lydia, attuned to the room, noticed the change and squeezed Sebastian's arm, asking what was wrong. He forced a smile and turned, willing the moment back into a party. This party wasn't what it seemed. It should have been a throwaway invitation. Old colleagues, a few investors, the press corps who liked him. Instead, the rooftop had become a field where old debts could be called and paid. Someone, Sebastian realized, with growing unease, had chosen tonight to arrive with the right kind of power. Kesha drifted through the crowd with the calm of someone with no use for small talk. She answered greetings with the minimal graciousness of someone who'd learned to ration her energy for what mattered. People who'd once sat at her laptop now asked for selfies with the man whose smile had become the company logo. Sebastian watched them praise him for decisions he had barely made and take photographs in which he was a legend, and she almost never existed. When Benjamin finally stepped forward, he bought the moment a kind of attention that made the party stop breathing. He knew the optics and used them. He greeted Lydia with an easy charm, then turned to Sebastian with the bland, corporate warmth of a man who'd kill a deal for fun. Sebastian tried to meet him with his practiced calm, but felt the old private panic that often came when the public story teetered at the edge of what people believed and what was true. Benjamin's greeting to Sebastian was concise. Happy birthday. Impressive turnout. Thanks, Sebastian answered too quickly. Good to see you, Ben. Benjamin's gaze dropped, just for an instant, to Kesha. There was no shock there. Only a recognition. Kesha Morgan, it's been a while. Their exchange was small, domestic, and it landed like a stone in a glass of champagne. Around them people resumed laughing with a nervous lilt. Sebastian tried to joke about a blast from the past, and Lydia laughed with the correct emphasis. But beneath the surface the room was listening for the rest of the sentence that didn't come. Kesha's voice, when she spoke, was soft but clear. Congratulations on the year, Sebastian. There was a simplicity to it that stripped away his rehearsed persona. For a moment he saw the warehouse, the real beginning end felt absurdly exposed. That memory came back in a different light. 4 years earlier, the company had been the kind of tight, chaotic thing that never made it into glossy press photos. The incubator smelled of pizza and solder and the kind of failure that shone when nobody else was watching. Kesha sat cross-legged on a creaky table, laptop balanced on knees, fingers flying in a way that made code look like handwriting. She had a small, efficient way of laughing at her mistakes and then erasing them with better lines. Sebastian had the gift of speech and the hunger for the narrative. Together, they were dangerous. Kesha wrote the adaptive flow engine. It was a piece of code that taught the system to reroute workloads based on live performance metrics. It learned. It compensated. In their early demos, servers that would have crashed under traffic leveled off like a dam easing under pressure. Without it, the product would have stalled. With it, the company had a heartbeat that investors could sense. The nights were long. They argued over architecture and user needs in a way that blurred personal and professional. Kesha sketched on napkins, then moved to a whiteboard where formulas lived next to coffee stains. She had a stubborn belief in the clean, arroganto solution. Sebastian had the knack for shaping that into a story for investors. We're not a platform. We're the nervous system. He learned how to sell their code like a religion. At the first major pitch, there had been a moment when everything depended on who stood at the front. Kesha had been exhausted but present. She had rehearsed explanations about latency curves and the ethics of automated routing. Sebastian had worn the suit and told a story tight, charismatic, the kind of narrative that makes underwriters write checks instantly. He walked off stage with the applause and left the technical validation to other talks. Investors left with Sebastian's phrase on their lips and not the smell of solder. When the company began to incorporate and file formal documents, Kesha discovered the omissions, slowly her name nowhere on patents. The commit history scrubbed of metadata that linked critical files to her account. Corporate filings that read like biographies re-authored by a publicist. She confronted him in the office one rainy evening. He told her she didn't understand the optics, that backers wanted a clean narrative, that names and faces were part of scaling. He framed it as strategy, as necessary sacrifice for the company's survival. He said the thing entrepreneurs say to soften theft, that the company's interest came first. The marriage that followed was brittle. In public, they were a couple who had co-founded a thing and made it happen. Privately, they eroded like a building in frost. When Kesha asked for what she had helped build, Sebastian offered footnotes, gratitude, and the occasional promise to make it right later. When later never came, she sought legal counsel. Divorce was the parting of two myths. Kesha signed separation papers that felt, at first, like a small surrender. The attorneys moved through details clearing dates, equity matrices that mentioned founder units in abstract terms. A financial settlement. But Kesha had never been careless. She had hidden one sentence in the section that mentioned contingent awards on insertion, so technical that most eyes would slide past it. Section 7. C. Read. In plain language, in the event of a capital infusion or financing round exceeding $50 million in aggregate value, she would be entitled to a contingent award equal to a defined percentage of fully diluted equity, subject to standard vesting and legal confirmation. The clause had been drafted with a lawyer she trusted. It was careful, not vindictive. She called it an insurance policy. Something for the future, when the company's numbers would finally be big enough to make her loss meaningful again. When the company closed its Series B and priced itself at a comfortable multiple, the clause had still felt abstract, something that would matter only if a major capital event occurred. At the time, she and Sebastian had been freshly divorced and trying to avoid waking old arguments. She kept the clause in part because it would have been impulsive to litigate patents, and in part because she had always believed in keeping leverage quiet, legal, practical. It was not a trap, only a way back to a truth that had been erased. Proof in black and white that tied her work to value. Back on the rooftop, the present pressed in. Benjamin's voice was velvet and brass when he finally asked, "Do you still work on adaptive systems, Kesha?" She answered simply, "I consult." The briefness of that sentence was a problem. It offered no apology, no plea. Sebastian's smile tightened. Lydia's hand, instinctively, moved toward his back. "Consult," Benjamin repeated. "Good. We should talk." The guests sensed the slow tighten. Benjamin excused himself and motioned to a few of his people lawyers who looked like well-tailored calculators on the tech lead with a camera bag. In 5 small gestures he signaled that whatever he had planned would be public and prepared. They moved inside toward the lounge, where a low stage had already been set up for Sebastian's toast. The party followed, a tide of curiosity surfacing. Someone from the press edged forward with a phone already recording. Sebastian smoothed his jacket, ready to reclaim the night. But he had the brief, awful awareness that the narrative he had spent years crafting might be unstitched thread by thread in the next minutes. Benjamin took the stage with a quiet authority that needed no amplification. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, someone flicked a switch, and the screens behind him snapped to life. A sequence of images and lines that were small, at first a photograph of a whiteboard with a messy diagram. A commit log time-stamped in the dead of night. A snippet of code with a variable name she favored. The metadata on a file labeled adaptive flow _v2_final PI, and then, in larger type, a handful of documents that clearly bore her name. The sound in the room thinned. Phones lifted like a slow wave. Sebastian's mouth went very dry. Benjamin's voice reached everyone. Calm, precise, almost neutral. 4 years ago, he said, a series of technical choices made this company resilient. The person who made them was not on the cover of every magazine. That person is here tonight. He let that sit. He showed a photo of a whiteboard scribbled with equations that matched live logs, pulled from an early staging instance. He had traced the architecture through commit history and archival emails. There were screenshots of the original design, Doxgacious handwriting in the margins, arrows, and clarifying notes. If narrative was the currency of influence, evidence was the currency of truth. And Benjamin had it in a stack. Sebastian tried to interrupt, to assert the collaborative nature of those nights. Our team, he began. But his words trod water against the clean, documented path Benjamin drug across the screen. I traced the engine intelectuator, Dinage Benjamin continued. I had my team verify file ownership and timestamps. Our counsel reviewed her separation agreement. Section 7.ci Contingent Equity. Provision becomes operative upon a qualifying capital event exceeding $50 million. With my firm's commitment of $65 million to a Series C round, the triggering condition has been met. The words landed like a gavel. People whispered legal phrases with an excitement entirely unmoored from the rhetoric of ethics. Sebastian's face flushed. You can't just, he began. Benjamin cut him off. This isn't just about theatrics. Counsel has been in touch with company legal and escrow. We filed a notice of intent to fund. We submitted supporting documentation to the corporate secretary. The mechanism is legal and documented. What remains now are the procedural steps: the formal board acknowledgement, the documentation to effect the transfer of contingent equity, standard escrow and vesting schedules. But the condition is not ambiguous. The crowd watched his measured competence like a jury watching a prosecutor lay out facts. Someone asked if this would destabilize the company. Benjamin answered with investor diplomacy. We are aligning incentives. We are not here to punish. We are here to correct and to invest in the product's future. Sebastian's mouth moved through a series of justifications. There are contributions from many people. You can't reduce an enterprise to a single name. That's not what we're doing, Keisha said, stepping forward for the first time since they had all entered the room. Her voice carried an odd calm that cut through the station of gossip. What we're doing is recognizing the architecture and the author. She didn't gloat. She didn't curse. She handed a few lines of context, simple facts about the engine's origin, a note about where the earliest iterations were deployed, and a quiet insistence that the people who built the product be acknowledged because it mattered to the users and the team. Her words were concise, measured, legal adjacent, but human. My goal isn't to dismantle the product or the team. It's to correct the record and to align incentives fairly so the work we began can continue under honest authorship. The crowd responded with a low hum. Some applauded. Some shifted uncomfortably. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. This was not the collapse he'd expected to avoid. Here she stood without pleading, and the room had been given evidence they couldn't unsee. Sebastian tried another tack. The old play of charm and incredulity. Kesha, you left? You walked away. You signed documents. Kesha answered without flinching. I did. Because at that time, I believed the company needed to survive. I kept the clause because I knew that if we ever reached the scale where value matched invention, the record should reflect the truth. That's all Section 7.c ever was. A way to ensure that work ties to value. Her composure made his attempts sound like pettiness. People began to turn their attention away from his explanations and toward the screen, where images of engineering notes repeated in the air like a slow, impartial witness. Sebastian's voice rose. He spoke of team building and risk and the necessity of unified leadership. His words had the practiced cadence of a man used to being believed. But the screen showed otherwise. Commit histories, photographs of whiteboards listing her name, time-stamped emails in which she had been copied and consulted. It was not the melodrama of betrayal. It was the quiet accumulation of proof. Benjamin stepped closer. The funding isn't a stunt, he said. My firm will proceed with diligence. We will ensure counsel is retained, filings are made, and that any transfer or allocation is done according to corporate law and the company's That means the board will have to sign off, and corporate counsel will implement the transfer processes. It is not instantaneous, but the trigger exists, and we have initiated all the procedural steps. Sebastian's shoulders slumped slightly at the phrase, not instantaneous. Public had imagined instantaneous humiliation, a viral image. A single tweeted here was something more sophisticated and more damaging. The slow, legal unraveling of a story he'd sold as true. He tried one last gambit, the personal appeal. Kesha, there are jobs at stake. People will be hurt. This is messy. Kesha tilted her head, the slightest expression that acknowledged vulnerability and responsibility. I understand that. I also understand that there are people who have built this product who deserve to be named. If the company is to be worthy of the customers who trust it, it must be honest about how it got here. The room listened as a judge might. There was a pause long enough for the band to nearly remember it was supposed to be playing. Then Benjamin did something that reframed everything with a single, unexpected action. He took Kesha's hand, not in a possessive grip but in a public gesture of solidarity on investor, making a point with an uncostumed human act. The cameras pivoted. For a suspended second the world seemed to align, a billionaire's hand on the shoulder of the woman whose name had been missing from the credits. Then Benjamin leaned forward and kissed her on the cheek. Brief, public, an act heavy, with recognition and with a personal pledge in front of witnesses. There was a sound that was not applause. It was the room inhaling sharply. Lydia's smile fell. Sebastian's jaw worked. His face moved into something that was almost disbelief and something that was worse. The sensation of watching the script that had defined him be edited without his consent. The kiss was not a private movie moment. It was a statement. Benjamin's lips on Kesha's cheek told the world that he had chosen to publicly stand with her, to legitimize her claim in a way no spreadsheet could. It was a poetically small gesture with enormous theatrical consequence. In that instant the party's tone shifted from celebration to tribunal to, for some, the cleansing wind of overdue recognition. The press flashbulbs bloomed. Social feeds lit with snippets. Seconds later, Billionaire kisses co-founder at party became a headline in the space between breaths. Sebastian lunged, not physically, but rhetorically, declaring that this was a stunt. That funding could not be used to rewrite history. He accused Benjamin of grandstanding and suggested that the board would fight any unilateral action. His voice cracked in a way that made his earlier bravado look brittle. He threatened litigation as a reflex. Threats were his refuge when charm and narrative failed. Benjamin replied with the patience of someone who'd seen threats before. You can litigate. You can contest valuations and file claims. That happens in our world. But what I brought here tonight wasn't meant to be a spectacle to hurt you. I brought evidence and a commitment. We will do this through counsel, through corporate process. There will be documents and schedules. If you wish to begin proceedings, you will find that the evidence is in order and the clause is clear. The legal machinery, invoked, sounded like fate. Sebastian's threats evaporated under the pragmatic principle that law didn't care for pithy speeches. It cared for text and timestamps in firms that would bill by the hour. He faltered. Keisha, who had stood through this without overt triumph, now spoke in a voice that left no room for misinterpretation. My concern is the product and the people who rely on it. If the board wants leadership that tells the truth about authorship and aligns incentives fairly, I'm prepared to help them do that. If they want to litigate, so be it. But I will not allow the work to be erased. Her statement balanced principle and restraint. It was not revenge. It was stewardship. She used the language of continuity, product, people, incentives, not the language of personal triumph. For everyone listening, that made her demands look principled rather than vindictive. Benjamin then made an offer clear and blunt. His firm would seed a series of changes. He would fund a Series C of $65 million, conditional upon board approval, subject to due diligence. He proposed restructuring certain governance elements to ensure transparency on technical authorship and a seat at the table for engineering merit datals that had always sounded abstract in press kits but were suddenly concrete policy. He offered to underwrite legal fees for the corporate process to ensure the implementation of Section 7.c proceeds without unnecessarily delaying product development. It was, in investor terms, a strategic bet. It also positioned Benjamin as both investor and advocate, a sponsor with capital and public validation. The kiss had been the symbolic gesture. The funding and the governance proposals were the structural ones. The crowd's reaction was a complex, human thing. Relief for some, outrage for others, curiosity for many. The press murmured about optics and the moral geometry of power. Lydia looked stunned, not humiliated in a private, cartoonish way, but displaced. Sebastian's control had thinned to a sheen. He tried to bargain for years of invented contribution, for narrative nuance, for the idea that what made a company thrive was not a single author, but a chorus. In the end, the chorus argument felt like a plea to diminish the clarity the screens had offered. The evidence kept reasserting itself like tide against sand. Later, after legal teams made cautious plans and Benjamin's people began drafting letters of intent, Kesha stepped back from the center and smiled, one small, private, the kind of smile that comes after holding a lungful of air. She accepted Benjamin's offer to coordinate counsel and to shepherd the process. She declined to take center stage in anything that would destroy the product or the team out of spite. I'm not here to burn bridges, she said, voice even. I'm here to make sure the bridge is named after the people who built it. That line slid into conversations over the next hours and days. A good soundbite, but, more importantly, a principle. The board called a meeting within a week. Counsel filed notices, and a corporate secretary began the procedural work preparing the documentation that would affect the contingent awards allocation once all approvals were in place. It would, by design, take time. Nothing was instantaneous. Everything was deliberate. That deliberation, controlled by the law, was the precise opposite of the viral moment's bold punch. It was a juridical repair. Sebastian's capitulation to the procedural reality was gradual. He tried to match the tempo of the legal world with press statements and interviews, but the footage from the rooftop screens displaying engineering notes and a billionaire standing with the woman whose name had been invisible replayed in feeds he could not control. His former allies who'd celebrated his rise now worried about their own careers and how association with an edited narrative would read in the brutal light of public scrutiny. In private, he attempted to bargain senior advisory roles for Kesha, stock options, assurances of Kesha answered with clarity. She appreciated the offers but insisted on something different. Public credit and a fair mechanism for equity consistent with the clause she had negotiated. She wanted the record corrected more than she wanted a seat labeled co-founder for optics' sake. The difference mattered. She wanted truth, not theater. Benjamin watched this with an expression that combined appraisal and something gentler admiration, or something close. When the board finally confirmed the process and corporate counsel filed the initial paperwork to effect the contingent awards allocation under Section 7.c, They paused for a photograph. A week after the rooftop night, in a quieter conference room, Benjamin took Keisha's hand again, this time more casually, and leaned in to kiss her not as ceremony or spectacle, but as an unadorned, human confirmation of his commitment. The cameras captured the moment. This time it would be a softer echo of the rooftop kiss, a private punctuation in the middle of a corporate shift. For Sebastian, the ordeal ended not with a dramatic ousting but with a slow rearrangement. Investors pressed for transparency. Customers asked questions about authorship on forums. Journalists, who eat inconsistencies for breakfast, pieced together the timeline Sebastian had tried to simplify. Keisha, for her part, found a different kind of freedom. The equity that had been contingent was set in motion. Agreements drafted, escrows opened, vesting schedules discussed according to standard corporate practice. The governance reforms Benjamin proposed gave engineers a clearer voice in product decisions, and there were, for the first time in years, explicit processes to attribute technical authorship with public acknowledgement. On a rainy morning, a month later, she stood at a different kind of podium-less glitter, more conference room, and addressed a team of engineers who had kept the product afloat through turbulence. Her tone was modest, surgical, almost. "I don't want to rewrite history into a series of hero moments," she told them. "I want us to be honest. The people who build things deserve to be named, and the systems we make should be built so they're accountable to the people who use them." It was a different victory than the viral images suggested. It was less about a kiss and more about the practical scaffolding that allowed authorship to be recognized in the messy business of startups. It required lawyers to do their work, boards to confront discomfort, and investors to put their money where their mouth was. It was, deliberately, a long game. Sebastian watched this from a distance that felt newly honest. There were interviews in which he described his mistake as a failure of communication and a lesson in humility. He did not become a villain in the tabloid sense. He became a cautionary character, a man who had learned the social geometry of recognition the hard way. For someone who had built narratives for a living, living within a corrected narrative was a strange, chastening thing. In the end, the rooftop night remained an image people returned to. The photograph of Benjamin kissing Keisha's cheek at the podium now had the power to tell a fuller story, of evidence presented, of law engaged, of an investor choosing to correct an omission in public and to use capital to make that correction operative. The kiss was the visceral punctuation. The legal and governance work that followed was the paragraph that explained why the punctuation mattered. Keisha never framed herself as a casualty who had been rescued. She framed herself as someone who had planned for contingencies and who had refused to let her work be quietly misattributed forever. Her public statements were always crisp and oriented toward continuity and accountability. She accepted funding, yes, but also insisted on structures that would prevent future erasures, not through spectacle, but through policy. On the last night of that month, she left the city in a black SUV with Benjamin in the passenger seat. He had become, in the view of some, an unlikely romantic ally. But to her, he was first an investor who had chosen to mobilize his resources for a clear corrective. He had also, privately, become someone she trusted to advocate for engineering integrity at the same scale that had once marginalized her. He had kissed her publicly. Yes, the act carried both personal warmth and strategic veracity. For journalists, the kiss was a delicious headline. For Keisha, it was acknowledgement in a single human gesture. As they drove away from the skyline that had once felt like Sebastian's drawn map, she looked back once at the roofline, and then forward. She smiled not triumphantly, but with the relief of someone who had her labor recognized and her future clarified. "My name is on the work now," she said quietly, to herself more than anyone else. "That is enough." The city swallowed the taillights as they pulled into the night. Behind them, the rooftop party would dissolve into analysis and rumor. Ahead, there would be meetings, paperwork, and product sprints that required the patient discipline of engineers. There would be investors and legal firms and the careful architecture of corporate life. Beyond all of it, there would be the slow, satisfying work of rebuilding a record. Lines of code with correct authorship, whiteboards with permanent markers that bore names, press releases that reflected the truth. If the rooftop had once been a stage for Sebastian's carefully managed myth, it had become, that night, an instrument of restoration. Not because of a single public kiss though. The image would be replayed endlessly, but because someone with capital and conscience chose to validate evidence, engage counsel, and initiate the legal mechanisms that turned a clause into consequence. Weeks later, in the quiet of her new office on unfussy space, with a whiteboard and a kettle, Keisha opened her laptop to a thread of messages. Supportive notes from engineers, cautious congratulations from venture partners, and a short message from Benjamin. It read, essentially, "We did not make this about me. We made this about what's true. Let's keep building." She closed the message and looked out the window at a morning that made the city paler and kinder. On the channel that had once celebrated Sebastian's rise, comments threaded with complex sympathies. Some viewers felt justice had been served. Others worried about power dynamics and charismatic investors. Many simply asked what it felt like to have your name restored. The most common thread was a quiet admiration for the way Keisha had chosen to hold her dignity intact. Which moment hit you hardest? The rooftop silence when she first arrived, the screens that made the work visible, or the brief, public kiss that sealed both recognition and a kind of personal pledge? Tell us which scene resonated most. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.